16 notes. Moving on to the northern reaction to the abolitionist crusade, abolitionists were met with a lot of resistance, rotten eggs thrown at them. Charles Stewart was whipped in Plainfield, Connecticut, whipped out of town. You had a school for free blacks deposited in the middle of a swamp in Maine, New Hampshire. Abolitionist Elijah Lovejoy had his press destroyed 4 times and was eventually killed in Illinois. Pennsylvania Hall in Philadelphia was burned after an abolitionist meeting. Houses of blacks were destroyed after an abolitionist rally. William Lloyd Garrison was paraded through the streets of Boston with a noose around his neck. Come on, this is Boston. So what these incidents demonstrate is quite obvious, that the abolitionist movement wasn't exactly a majority movement up north. Now, the tactics of the abolitionists, they believed their cause was true. They were true believers. And they thought others, too, would be if they were informed on the issue. Thus, that was their goal, to educate others. They would have revivalist type meetings, emotionalizing the issue, trying to convert others to their cause. Newspapers kept up pressure, like The Liberator, some with stories of abuses of slaves. Now, politics, less successful. It was a balance of power deal. Underground Railroad, yes, it helped slaves escape, but a drop in the bucket compared to the influence that it had on the Southern mind and on the cause, leading to more tension. It was designed to move slaves to Canada. You had all kinds of things, like in wagons, you'd have furniture with phony floors, houses with fake walls and floors. And so the psychological impact was probably greater than the practical impact, but it was a great impact. Here's a video on going to Canada.
Pa should have been here by now. He's 3 hours late already. Pa ain't gonna make it! One of them slave catchers got so much help, and I just know
Liza, you both made it past the border yesterday. We've all done this before.
He's our pa. He'll be here.
Come, let's pray.
No more prayers!
Liza! Liza!
Between 1840 and 1860, more than 30,000 American slaves came secretly to Canada and freedom. They called it the Underground Railroad.
Lisa! We're free!
Yes, Pa, we can Canada!
Now, court battles. Let's look at the Nancy Jackson case real quick in 1837. Slave brought from Georgia to Connecticut. Court rules that laws of the state in which you reside apply, and thus frees her. Now, B. Amistad, 1839. Spanish slave ship incurs mutiny, taken over by a slave named Sink, drifts until finally picked up by U.S. Navy off the coast of Long Island. John Quincy Adams will argue for their freedom. A Southern judge orders them freed, but returned to Africa. Sink sets himself up as a slave trader. Then in 1842, Prigg versus Pennsylvania. This involved the original fugitive slave law of 1793, which urged state cooperation in the capture and return of fugitive slaves, ruled that states are not required to use state officials to enforce it. This would lead to the establishment of personal liberty laws. These laws that prohibited the involvement of state officials in the capture of return of fugitive slaves. State power versus national power here. These moderate gains through legal process win middle-class converts. Politics, again, not as successful. Abolitionists flooded Congress with petitions on the issue of slavery. You would have the birth of the Liberty Party in 1840 with the attempt to elect James Birney as president. He gets only 3,000 votes. So you can see abolitionism is not some nationwide party going crazy, capturing the imaginations of the country. Yet 20 years later, we're right at the door of civil war. So slow continued growth of the abolitionist movement. They are persistent and do gain converts. Nevertheless, it is slow. In 1844, you can see 62,000 votes for the Liberty Party. Immigrants tend to oppose abolitionists. Why? It's always the same reason. Jobs, jobs. It's always about the jobs. Manufacturers and bankers tend to oppose abolitionism. Hey, they own $300 million of Southern debt. If they all of a sudden have abolitionism, all of a sudden the cotton growers aren't making money, can't pay the debt. You see, you look to the money, you look to the power. All right, so Roman numeral 6, the basis of Southern opposition. First, the South overreacted to Garrison, thinking he was the spokesman of the abolitionists. He was radical and represented such a small percentage of the abolitionists in the North. Why? Frankly, he was vocal, visible, and he was heard. He made sure he was heard. They failed to understand the divisions within the movement of abolitionism, that Garrison represented the quote-unquote lunatic fringe of the movement, the very far edges. He wanted total equality now. I know, sounds like crazy. Ooh, how lunatic. Nat Turner's Rebellion occurs as the first copy of The Liberator is published. Notice the timing here.
Good grammar and spelling are important.
Oh, you're
but if
kidding
you want
me.
to write essays that inspire,
I was ordained for some great purpose in the hands of the Almighty.
Nat Turner was an enslaved African-American preacher who was born in 1800 and led a large-scale rebellion in 1831.
Nat Turner's ultimate goal was to end the system of slavery. So he chose violence as his only option. And that option, painful and bloody as it was, shook up the system.
Nat Turner was a mind-blowing experience to white culture and changed the game in a fundamental way.
They vowed before they started the revolt that they would kill every white person they saw. Men, women, and children.
They were done being dehumanized, they were done being treated as property, and they just rebelled.
The rebels followed kind of a zigzag path. They stopped at most of the houses along the way, killing the slaveholders and their families who they found there.
The judgment of this court is that you are to be taken hence to jail, thence to the place of execution, and be hung by the neck until you are dead, dead, dead.
Lynching in America were spectator sports. There were spectator events. People came from miles around, and bodies were dismembered. When people went to these kinds of affairs, they wanted to take a souvenir away that proved to everybody that they were there and that that person, that monster, is now no longer alive. And how do I know that? Because I've got a piece of his body right here.
Now, the effects this would have would be, first off, a huge clampdown on African slaves. Slave codes were enacted, making it illegal to read. They couldn't be in groups of more than 3. Anything to prevent them from thinking about revolt. Now remember, if you're a southern slave owner, let's say in South Carolina, you're in part of the area where 70% of the people are African Americans, you know, you might be sleeping with one eye open, especially after Nat Turner's revolt. I mean, women, children with machetes. Oh, it was ugly. I mean, the Southern reaction was important here for the causes of the Civil War. And look at the timing. This gives Garrison gravitas. Probably the South should have just ignored him. Here's a little of Garrison.
But scattered around the country, a few lonely souls were convinced that slavery was a crime against God and man. And in Boston, one of them was coming to understand that God intended he do something about it. William Lloyd Garrison felt that he was destined to do great things, but he had no idea how to get there. In 1828, he was 22 years old, newly arrived in the city from his hometown of Newburyport. Garrison's father, a seaman and a drunk, had abandoned the family when Garrison was 2 years old. Plunged into poverty, Garrison's mother left her children for years on end as she looked for work. But in their time together, she managed to drum a fierce Christian conscience into her son.
William Lloyd Garrison's religious background was not just a background. It was at the core of who he was. It was an indwelling spirit inside of him that constantly thought about making God's will come into being on this earth.
Shortly after arriving in Boston, Garrison happened to meet an itinerant publisher who was raising money for his one-man anti-slavery newspaper. Garrison was horrified by descriptions of the slave pens where men, women, and children were held awaiting shipment further south. And he began to think that ending slavery was the cause that could give meaning to his life.
So even here you can see the Second Great Awakening having its impact on Garrison and the abolitionist movement.
William Lloyd Garrison felt that he was destined to do great things, but he had no idea how to get there. In 1828, he was 22